Right. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is David McCoy. I'm the Evidence to Policy Lead at the International Institute for Global Health, part of the United Nations University. I have a background in medicine, and I was formerly a professor of global public health at Queen Mary University in London. And I'm joined on this webinar by 4 members of an independent expert group convened by UNU-IIGH to assess the problematic aspects of global university rankings. And independent expert group convened also to make recommendations for how these problematic aspects may be mitigated. Next slide, please. Just a very quick word to begin with about UNU-IIGH. The United Nations University itself is headquartered in Tokyo and comprises 13 different institutes that are scattered across the world. We belong to the International Institute responsible for global health, based in Malaysia. We're a designated think tank for the UN system. And part of our mandate is really to kind of look at global health issues, policies, programs through the lens of the global South. Part of our mandate is to look at policies and practices that give inappropriate and unfair preference to wealthy countries and populations, and to make recommendations for how this may be changed. Next slide, please, Tiffany. As part of this work, we've been looking at the way in which global university rankings create biases and reinforce a coloniality in the global higher education system. In February of this year, we published a briefing paper about this and then convened afterwards an international and independent expert group to assess the global university rankings. And after several conversations and discussions amongst this independent expert group, we published 2 weeks ago a statement by the independent expert group. And what we'll be doing in this webinar is presenting that statement. There will then be time for questions and answers. And before we come to that, let me just first introduce the 4 members of the independent expert group who will be walking us through the statement. First off, we have Sharon Fon, a full professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Sharon has a degree in medicine and has also been the head of the School of Public Health and acting dean of the Faculty of Health Science, and was president of the Association of Schools of Public Health in Africa from 2014 to 2017. She currently co-leads the Consortium of Advanced Research Training in Africa, which consists of 8 African universities seeking to build a vibrant African academy to produce top quality research. She's also a visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg and has published well over 90 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, amongst many other things. We then have Riyad Shahjahan, an associate professor of higher adult and lifelong education at Michigan State University, and a core faculty member of Muslim Studies, Chicano and Latino Studies at the Asian Studies Center and the Center for Advanced Study of International Development. He's also an honorary visiting professor at the International Institute of Higher Education Research and Capacity Building at the O.P. Jindal Global University in India. His areas of research include the globalization of higher education and decolonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial theory. He's conducted both empirical and theoretical work on the role of transnational actors in globalizing higher education policy, amongst other things. He has also served as an elected board member of the Comparative and International Education Society. Third, we have Eugene Richardson, a medical doctor and assistant professor of global health and social medicine at Harvard University. He previously served as the clinical lead for Partners in Health's Ebola response in Kona district in Sierra Leone, where he continues to conduct research. His current focus includes biosocial approaches to epidemic disease prevention, containment, and treatment, as well as the health effects of climate change. He's also the current co-chair of the Walter and Patricia Rodney Commission on Reparations and co-chair of the Global Environmental Change Commission on Climate Justice. And he is the author of the book, Epidemic Illusions on the Coloniality of Global Public Health. And finally, we have Marion Lloyd, research professor at the Institute for the Study of the University and Education at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and who is also its Deputy Director of Institutional Evaluation. Before becoming an academic, Marion worked as a journalist and foreign correspondent in the Caribbean, South Asia, and Latin America for the Boston Globe, for the Houston Chronicle, and for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Her current academic work focuses on comparative higher education policy, access, and equity, as well as on intercultural higher education. Her research is guided by decolonial theory, which highlights the lasting effects of colonialism in perpetuating arbitrary power, racial, and knowledge hierarchies. And she's written extensively on the impacts of the university rankings on institutions in the Global South. So that is our brilliant and fantastic panel that we have tonight, this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are. We are inviting all of you to pose questions in the question and answer function on Zoom. Please do that. But for now, let me hand over to Sharon to present the statement, or to begin presenting the statement. Over to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Greetings, everyone. It's good evening, almost good night from where I am. I think we all understand the role of universities in society. They play crucial roles, obviously delivering education and training. And they produce knowledge, information, and evidence, and they play a critical role in contributing to public policy debate and practice. And through independent academic inquiry and they enable informed public discussion. And they help, in the best case, to strengthen democracy, protect human rights, and serve as hubs for cultural and civic engagement. By enabling equitable access for those universities that do, they allow for social mobility and fairness across society. And through international research and through scientific collaborations, they help promote cross-border cooperation, trust, and peace, of which we could do with some right now. And for these reasons, for their multiple functions, it is absolutely vital that we protect, promote, and develop these social and public interest functions of universities. Next slide, please. For the past 2 decades, however, global university rankings have had a large and increasing influence over higher education worldwide. And I think it's worth making the point that it's only for the past 2 decades. It's a recent phenomenon. Today, there are many, dozens and dozens of university league tables and rankings that universities are often desperate to do well on. And they compete and have become they compete for ranking status in an increasingly competitive and globalized higher education market. Among those, which are quite influential, are the Shanghai rankings, the QS rankings, and the Times Higher Education ranking. However, the rankings have incentivized some improvement in quality of some universities, but there's really growing recognition that they incentivize a number of perverse, and we argue harmful, behaviors and produce systemic long-term negative effects. In our statement, we summarize these problems under 9 headings, and I'm going to go through the first few of those. The first and most fundamental problem, could we have the next slide, please? is that really it's not possible to accurately and appropriately represent the quality of different universities with their diverse functions and missions in different parts of the world, where they have varied social, political, and economic contexts within a single quantitative measure of performance. Furthermore, any attempt to combine the teaching function, the research function, and other universities' functions into a single composite indicator is always arbitrary and therefore questionable. And finally, the idea of the zero-sum game, of the hierarchy of rankings, suggests that higher education is in limited supply, and that no two universities can expect to have equal status. And this is clearly simply false. It's simply not true of reality. The second problem is that the data and methods used to produce rankings is flawed. Of particular note is the heavy reliance on subjective judgments of quality made by non-representative samples of survey respondents, and on citation counts as measures of research quality. Any of us who understand research methods will understand that this is simply no way to represent reality. Unrepresentative samples, people who self-select, they are biased in multiple ways. And just basic research tells you that this is not a good way of doing something. While there is some information about the methods that are used to produce the rankings by the ranking agencies, neither the methodological details nor the data sets used are made publicly available. You know, for those of us who are empiricists, the idea of falsification, of data being there, the idea of sharing data so that I can go and use your data and repeat your findings is an absolute fundamental tenet of what constitutes good research. You can't do that. This presents, because it's not shared, because their methods are not transparent, no one can verify or critically evaluate the rankings that they produce. And this raises concerns about bias and about objectivity. The third problem is that the major rankings display a bias towards research, towards science, technology, engineering, and maths, the so-called STEM disciplines, towards Anglophone institutions and journals, and they diminish the importance of other university functions that we've discussed earlier, teaching, the improvement of public policy and debate, and they also downplay the value of the humanities and social sciences. And they downplay the value of the contribution to science, which has been made not in English, but in other languages. Furthermore, the bias towards cutting-edge research pulls universities away from conducting research that is more practical, action-oriented, and relevant to the real-world needs of the context that they're in and to policies and programs. It makes universities those ivory towers we believe they shouldn't be. Related to this fourth problem of global ranking reflecting perspectives, standards, and traditions that favor wealthier, older, larger, and more research-intensive universities. None of the major rankings control for the resources available to a university or use methods that adjust for challenging the unstable political or policy context in which universities find themselves. They therefore help to reproduce existing inequalities and structures of privilege within and across countries and regions. None of us would take seriously an article which used empirical data where we didn't standardize through a multiple regression, and yet we take these rankings seriously. Importantly, rankings can help perpetuate a self-reinforcing system of winners and losers that works against the efforts to raise the tide and raise the standard across the board and across the system. In the next slide, we see an illustration of the dominance of universities from the global north in the Times Higher Education ranking system. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Riyadh.
Thank you so much, Sharon. So I'm going to continue with our basic points about what makes rankings problematic. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the things we need to consider is that rankings is not just about institutions. It has large, broader implications on the sector itself. So with rankings, by focusing on particular individual institutions and individual performance, it stifles the notion of cooperation and shared responsibilities among the various higher education institutions that are out there. Furthermore, it impacts a systematic way of improving the sector and limits addressing societal change. Overall, what I'm trying to say here, or we're trying to say here, is that rankings basically diminishes the diversity of institutional types that are out there that are important for the higher education ecosystem in the world. It tends to homogenize the sector rather than celebrate the diversity and difference of institutional types, disciplines, and knowledge systems. The next point is that rankings also encourage a very temporal dimension, this idea of short-term solutions. And it does so because rankings, as you probably are aware of, tends to publish their global rankings every year or annually. And so in doing so, it makes universities strive to position themselves in relation to others and create these short-term strategies in order to improve their rankings. But in doing so, they oftentimes neglect the long-term objectives or those objectives that are not quantifiable in the short term. Added to that, what's important to understand is that beyond just the temporal element, with the temporal element comes this kind of reputational anxiety, as some of our colleagues call rankings are engines of anxiety. Particularly given these rankers are commercial, they are for-profit companies who try to exploit and mobilize the collective emotions of institutions, individuals in terms of precarity, and then they try to offer their services as solutions. In doing so, it creates these perverse behaviors that we see within institutional stakeholders, such as increasing payments to publish in high-impact journals, corporate branding, or data manipulation and fabrication. Next slide, please. Furthermore, it's important to understand that rankers, particularly Times Higher Education and Quaker Simmons, QS, are both commercially driven. They are commercial companies. Both of them began as these media companies. And so these are companies that are basically who offer rankings for free, but then they are driven to sell advertising as well as their performance-related products. And that's what's key for us to understand, is that these are commercial products that are being sold to us. And in doing so, as Sharon mentioned, there's a whole absence of transparency of the way they're doing things. Tied to that, our point number 9 is that the ranking industry also creates a conflict of interest. As we mentioned, given their profit maximization goals and their relationship to other private corporations, such as major publishers, such as Elsevier, Clarivate, to name some, it creates a lot of, they are not necessarily objective observers of what's going on in higher education. And with that, I will give it off to my next colleague, Eugene, please.
Hello, everyone. All right, is this not your slide? The last one to finish, Riyadh?
Yeah, that was my last slide. I just did.
Negative effects. Okay, so are we on slide 11?
I believe so.
The slide about what should be done to prevent these negative effects.
Yes, that's okay. I had that as Riyadh has. I'm not 11 and 12.
Maybe if you go ahead, Eugene, and go
Okay.
on to your, yeah.
All right. So I come at this from having, I guess, for the last, since 1995, been constantly at top tier universities, and having a PhD in anthropology, I guess I've participated in, what would we call it, participant observation and collusion in how universities really recycle elite privilege. To me, I was naive when I started, but I now over these years seen that function of elite schools as recycling not only class, but where class intersects with whiteness and other supremacist identities. I mean, just one, the school I currently represent, Harvard, I believe 67% of students are from the top 20% of family earners in as far as family incomes. And so, that stat right there, I think, is emblematic of the job the universities are doing. And these rankings collude in that reproduction. That if you see these universities as an apparatus, kind of an Althusserian apparatus for recycling certain privileges, the rankings collude in that. And so what kind of things can we do to prevent these negative effects? The first thing to say is that it's not enough to simply call for better methods by which to rank universities. Rather, the entire system and model of rankings per se need to be questioned. While quantitatively measuring the performance of universities may be a legitimate and useful exercise, and while some universities may want to be able to benchmark their performance against international standards, there is a pressing need to mitigate the harms and problems associated with global university rankings and limit the influence that commercial organizations have in higher education. More than ever, there is a need to better harness the qualities of higher education as a whole to better respond to the urgent and serious challenges facing the world. Instead of leaving higher education to be driven towards becoming a homogenized but unequal market of winners and losers based on arbitrary, dubious, and simplistic criteria, we thus call for 3 sets of actions. Next slide, please. First, we call on policymakers, university leaders, and others to recognize and encourage greater debate about the systemic negative effects of university rankings. We also call on international and national media to cease sensationalist reporting when new rankings are released and instead open up space for critical and reflexive commentary on rankings and promote a better informed public discourse on higher education and its role in society. We also call on national and international evaluation and funding bodies to not use standings in global rankings as a criterion in their assessments and decisions on competitive funding. And we call on universities to adopt a more critical stance when displaying their rankings in promotional material to enable prospective students and the wider public to understand the biases, limitations, and arbitrary nature of global university rankings. Next slide, please. And is this for me or for our next panelist?
I think I take over from here.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you, Eugene. Good afternoon to everybody from Mexico. It's wonderful to be here. Secondly, in terms of this set of actions, we call for the adoption of alternative and better ways to evaluate universities and describe the relative strengths and weaknesses. We feel that there is no need to be trapped by the reputational anxiety that is strategically manufactured by rankings, especially given their use of invalid, costly, and top-down performance metrics. In addition, we call for the higher education sector to be governed in ways that ensure that universities that provide important public service functions are not disadvantaged. This is particularly true for universities in the Global South. We call for several initiatives to receive greater attention, and these include More Than Our Rank, which is an initiative that acknowledges a broader and more diverse definition of university success or quality, U Multi-Rank, which is a non-commercial European initiative that rates universities across 5 areas of performance to provide a fairer picture of the profiles of universities, which could inspire similar approaches in other regions. The African Quality Rating Mechanism, which is a self-assessment tool developed by the Association of African Universities to help universities rate themselves against a more appropriate set of standards. And finally, a Universities of the Netherlands expert group, which has called for universities in the Netherlands to be more responsible in their use of rankings, provide better communication about the limitations of league tables, and make greater use of existing alternatives. In addition, there are several initiatives that specifically promote better research metrics, such as the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, COARA, and the Humane Metrics Initiative. Next slide, please. Finally, we call for a rebalancing of the dynamic between universities and commercial rankers. And we try to highlight the need to address the conflicts of interest currently built into the rankings industry. This is this idea that rankings are profiting from the exercise to the detriment, particularly of universities in poorer regions of the world. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, the previous one still. Thank you. Presently, rankings organizations collect vast amounts of data from universities and publicly accessible sources, which they privatize, commodify, and then use to extract resources, not just from universities, but also from governments and other interested parties. This practice is both ethically and economically questionable. We thus call on university administrators, relevant ministries, media, academics, students, and international organizations to properly evaluate the social benefits and economic value of commercial rankers, and to curtail their extractive, exploitative, and manipulative practices. We specifically call on universities and academics to consider, number one, not submitting data and information for commercial ranking purposes, as many universities in the United States have been doing recently with the boycott against US News and World Report, and also to refrain from making the submitted data publicly available on their websites. Two, not participating in reputation surveys distributed by rankers, these surveys in which they cold call academics and ask for their opinions, which is clearly very subjective. Thirdly, not purchasing products and services from the commercial rankers. And finally, not hosting or participating in events organized by the commercial rankers. Rather than perceiving themselves as powerless victims and bystanders of the developments that have just been described, academics can act more proactively and inspire positive change in the sector and for society as a whole. The final slide, please. So therefore, we feel that we need a more holistic, equitable, and context-sensitive view of higher education quality and improvement, in contrast to the reductionist, one-size-fits-all model which has been promoted by the global university rankings. Ministries of education, national university associations are critical in directing sector-wide systemic change and enabling universities to strive not only for their own improvement, but for the betterment of society, locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon, Riyad, Eugene, and Marion, for that lucid and comprehensive description of the statement as it was published two weeks ago. A couple of questions to put to you now. Firstly, in terms of research, I'd like to maybe begin with Eugene and Sharon and ask you about, this tricky problem of how one assesses the quality of good research, and particularly from your perspective of working in the African region. How would you go about doing that from an African perspective? And what does that mean for a global assessment of research quality? Maybe I could start with you, Sharon, and then move on to Eugene.
So I think that when we reflect on what constitutes good research, you first of all want to have a research question that is clear, concise, and relevant. And relevance will differ in different places and should differ in different places. So if we wanted to link that to a university, I think that universities should be looking in their context at the kinds of issues that need to be solved there. So that would be one way of looking at it. Secondly, these things are international and are consistent, and that has to do with good quality research. In other words, employing the right methods to answer that question. And I think what's very interesting about the diversity of universities, of their locations, of their contexts, is often those methods, how those research questions are formulated, whether one takes a transdisciplinary approach, by which I mean including more than the academic themselves in defining those research questions, but getting policy players or the people who might benefit or be harmed by particular research to be involved in it. These are the kinds of things that I think would make for what I would consider to be good quality research, the right kind of questions with the appropriate method. And these are going to vary from place to place. I think the other thing that's important to say is that irrespective of where you are in the world, you can be doing what we often call blue sky research. You can often be doing high-tech research. You can often be doing applied research. Applied research is required as much in Europe and in America as it is required in Africa. And at the same time, high-tech research is required everywhere. So I don't think that there's a parceling out of where it happens, but it does depend on resources. And often those resources are skewed if the same kind of research is done in the same place.
Thanks, Sharon. Eugene, do you want to weigh in on that issue of how we assess the quality of research?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think that assessments are a complete artifact again of what benefits will accrue to global elites. And so, you know, of course, there's research on medical advances and things that you know, have the potential to help all of humanity. But again, even in even in that realm, you see we have our neglected tropical diseases, and then an overabundance of money going towards cardiovascular disease or gout, or things that affect rich global northerners. So I think there has to be a kind of epistemic justice movement, and I sit on a commission of epistemic justice that's kind of working in this area to you know, we're not just talking about decolonizing university rankings, but across the board. And what that would look like in the research realm is, and I'm not the best person to talk about this, but I'll refer you to our Maori colleague, Linda Tuhoai-Smith, her fantastic book, Decolonizing Methodologies. She really gets into how a lot of the research we do is completely useless and meaningless to the people that we often use it as subjects. And so really taking an approach that sees where the benefits of oversighting something, or the benefits of highly promoting certain ways of seeing the world accrue. Again, I focus on infectious diseases, and so I have a lot of critiques of places like Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is an epidemiology unit based at the University of Washington that has received over $600 million from Bill Gates alone. And they do COVID studies that say things like, oh, if you wear masks, if you social distance, then you know, we could go from 1 million deaths in the US to 200,000 deaths. And in both scenarios, 3 times the number of Black people are dying. And so it's, you know, this premier objective knowledge production center is actually recycling, normalizing racial injustices in society. And so I think an important part of looking at academia going forward is deconstructing these practices to show the coloniality, the imperial work that they do. And that'll open up space for kind of the pluriversal, right? The polyvocal approaches to knowledge production. Because right now, just like the university rankings, it's totally one-sided towards what benefits can accrue to those that are already in elite positions.
Thanks, Eugene. I just want to dig into this whole issue of research and assessing research quality, because there is the issue of what is good research and what makes for good research methods and questions. But what the rankings is trying to do is to evaluate the performance of entire institutions in terms of the quality of their research. And if you're a minister of education or a minister of health in a country like Malawi, for example, is it appropriate that he or she should be able to assess the quality of research performance of the universities in that country, in that context? And if so, how would that be done? So I'll open this up to any of you to respond to. Marion, you've put your hand up. Why don't you kick off with that?
There's another Marianne Lloyd.
Oh, there's another. Okay. Yeah. Sharon, did you want to come in on that?
I think, David, I'm not 100% if I get your question, but I do think that what we find is that there is a hierarchy, for example, in terms of what some people think constitutes good research. So, for example, there's a hierarchy around you've made it as a researcher if you publish in Science or Nature. But they're very particular kinds of research that is published in Science and Nature, and it's a very small subsection of the research that's done internationally. And it's very often the kind of research that might be applied immediately, but usually often isn't. It's research that's leading to findings that might lead to other research, or it's going to maybe never be applicable. It's something that's very interesting and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not necessarily applicable. If I was, let's take where I am, which is in South Africa. One of our biggest problems is that we don't have a functional health system, for example. Research around what makes for functional health systems is much more important than a randomized controlled trial that compares one statin against another statin. But the randomized controlled trial is much more likely to be published than something that someone finds hard to evaluate because it's not using standardized methods. The thing about randomized controlled trials, which are the hierarchy, the high end of medical research, actually only answer a very, very small number of important questions. And in fact, to do them, there's like a recipe book about how you actually do a randomized controlled trial. Whereas if you're trying to answer complex questions, you can't apply a recipe book type of method to it. And that would be something like your question about the education minister in Malawi. He wants his university, she wants her universities to be able to solve local problems and to be able to be probably doing interdisciplinary research. And often those aren't the kinds of journals that have got high rankings. If you're doing interdisciplinary research or transdisciplinary research, there are very few journals that will publish your work. And yet if you want to work on climate change, if you want to work on equity, if you want to work on justice, these things are not done by single disciplines. And so what is considered to be quality, being published in a good journal, being cited often, are not necessarily the things that lead to social progress, to social equity. And so I think that downplaying those are really problematic. And I think that the way rankers give credit and value to things that aren't necessarily social goods and public goods is enormously problematic.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sharon. So I know that Michelle has got a question. Michelle, can you pop your question into the Q&A chat box function? Sure. And we'll get to it as soon as we can. But let me just bring in Marion and Riyadh now. And really pose the question on whether or not, part of the solution is to get away from these universal and global matrices and to instead have country-specific or region-specific indices of performance. Would that solve some of the problems, or do we need to think, beyond that in terms of kind of solutions that are needed? Marion?
Sure, I'll go ahead. That's a really hard question. It's pretty much the question. Do we try to improve on the existing systems, or do we try to throw them out the window and start something new? I certainly feel that the regional rankings or the subject-oriented rankings pretty much all have the same problems. They're highly reductionist, they're colonialist, they have the same biases. These main rankers, the three that we've mentioned, have their regional rankings and they rejigger the formulas for the methodologies, but really it's the same phenomena. I think it's much more important to think in terms of, I think it's very important to have information about universities, but we can have information about different aspects of universities without ranking universities as such. And certainly, being in the Spanish-speaking world, there's a huge disadvantage, for example, of publishing in Spanish. So my colleagues, or in Portuguese, my colleagues have this huge dilemma. Do I publish in Spanish and then, and have my colleagues who are in the region understand and can read it? Or do I publish it in English and then I get paid more and I move up through my university system, but people in other parts of the world are using it, and maybe that knowledge is not going to be to the benefit of the region. So I think it's this idea that we can somehow rejigger, which is what the kind of response of the rankers has been to this movement of boycotts and criticisms is, okay, well, we'll just tweak here and there. In the United States with this boycott, I think one of the questions someone asked is, does it make sense to boycott the rankings? You need to have a critical mass of people boycotting. And I think that's very true. But when they suggest these changes, or we need to take into account the social contribution of universities, so the rankers say, okay, then we'll put in a metric for how many government grants the students are receiving. But at the end, it's the same idea. It's this idea that there is such thing as the best university, and whether we're talking about a country or region or the entire world, I think the basic logic is highly problematic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marion. Riyad, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things I want to say. Number one is that, yes, the commercial rankers themselves have created a lot of these regional subject-based rankings, but what has also been another phenomena is that countries have then adopted some of these and tweaked it a little bit to create their own ranking. So for instance, you have the Indian ranking, National Institute Research Framework. Malaysia has created its own system, adopting something from QS. So you have these different countries and ministries trying to adopt these systems. The problem is, as Marion pointed out, you can compare institutions, but then when you start to create the zero-sum ladder of who's what, then the question it begs is based on what criteria. And so the criteria is the problem that we are having, is who determines that criteria? Who gets to be in those decision-making bodies who create these criteria in the first place? I think that's number one. The other thing I don't think we've discussed so far in this discussion is, what is quality? The word quality is a problematic term, because quality can be interpreted in so many ways. So oftentimes what happens with quality, as Eugene was mentioning, is that often quality becomes a proxy for exclusion. So the more you exclude, the higher quality you are. So for instance, if your journal acceptance rate is low, then people consider that to be a proxy of quality. If your acceptance rate into a university like Harvard or Oxford is low, then that's considered to be higher quality, right? So, and as some of you were talking about, quality could be equated with relevance. In other words, how much does it respond to societal needs? That could be a form of quality as well. So again, we need to ask ourselves, when we say the word quality, quality research, quality education, quality university, what are the criteria or semantics and assumptions underlying even the word quality? So I'll just stop there.
Great, thank you, Riyad. I want to kind of just pick up on one of the questions from the audience now about what we do with the problem of global university rankings. And one of the audience members talks about universities essentially facing a prisoner's dilemma. You know, if you boycott rankings, you get punished. And in some instances, you can try and boycott the rankings, but the rankers will go ahead and rank your university anyway. And by not participating, you end up doing your own university a disadvantage. So how do we respond to this problem of challenging the kind of power and influence that these rankers seem to have over universities? I mean, it really does seem like the tail wagging the dog here. But yeah, any thoughts on how we respond to this this system?
Marian's.
I would, yeah, I think that it's a very good question, and I think certainly, obviously, there's strength in numbers, and so the initiatives like more than our rank is this idea that you put on your website, we are deliberately not participating in the rankings, and so the more you have these kind of wider organizations of if an individual university doesn't participate, it's going to move down in the ranking because it's going to not provided certain information that might help its case. But if the entire research universities throughout Latin America, which I see that as very problematic, I think it's a lot easier in the global north to do this from a position of strength, decide to boycott these rankings, it's going to have much more of an effect. To the degree to which the boycott in the United States has been from the top ranked institutions, it's been extremely effective. And then recently there's been this case of Utrecht University in Germany, which is also one of the highest ranked universities, coming out and saying that it's not going to participate in Times Higher Education. But what's to me been fascinating is how they've had to publicize this so broadly, to say, look, everybody, it's not that we don't think we're a great university, it's that we're against this rankings model. But I think really it has to be a question of kind of safety in numbers, and that, much more of a mass movement, which, then kind of discredits if a huge percentage of the top ranked institutions refuse to participate in the exercise, or a huge number of academics stop responding to the survey requests, then the whole exercise itself is going to be in jeopardy. So, but I think it's certainly extremely hard, and certainly in Latin America, hardly anybody is trying to talk about it. However, I think there's a glimmer of this perhaps in Argentina. For some reason, the top ranked Argentine universities have not been participating in Times Higher Education, and I've been putting on my journalist hat and trying to find out what's going on there, because I'm sure there's some kind of a resistance among those universities. But yeah, I think it's a very complicated problem, but I think unless it becomes a much broader movement, and obviously that's what we're trying to do with this international group and the statement, it's going to be very hard to have the correlation of power to push back against this model. Thank you.
So it seems some coordination amongst universities and amongst ministries of education is really important. And I guess one of the other questions we had from the audience was, what is the strategy now for using the statements to kind of build a more collective response to the problems that have been identified in the statement? I don't know if any of you panel members have got any thoughts or suggestions about what we do next now that we've analyzed the problem and we've made some clear recommendations. What next?
Well, actually, it's great to have Michelle here, because she's been writing a lot about the role of media. I think one of the reasons why we have a hard time disentangling from university rankings is the role of media. News media, whatever, social media, plays a major role in the ways in which ranking gets entangled with the public. It's not universities that circulate it per se, they do so for social media, but it's the newspapers that make such a big deal that trickles down into governments, and then the universities have to respond and so forth, right? So I think for us, in terms of the statement circulation, and I've shared this already, is mediatization. That's unfortunate. You have to play the rankers game. How media plays, when Marian talks about numbers, one of the reasons why rankers focus on, say, social media versus news media is simply because of the speed in which the news moves. and goes to people's cell phones instead of their doorsteps, for instance, right? And so I think similarly for us, we have to play that similar kind of media game because we are entangled in a mediascape. So that's one recommendation I would say.
I think the other one is also to publicize the content of why they're problematic. I think people don't understand quite how subjective they are. I think people don't understand also the perverse incentives that the ranking agencies have. So we've made that clear in the statement that you can sell your services to a university to help them report to you better, so you get ranked higher. They can help you with systems to do that. And you know, we speak about conflict of interest, and yet somehow they get away with doing this and speak proud and about themselves, and yet we don't point this out sufficiently. And I think the audiences that need to understand this are clearly governments, if they are putting pressure on their universities to rise in the rankings, particularly parents whose children are going to universities. They really need to understand that actually your child, if you're at a highly ranked university, there's a good chance it's spending a lot of its money that it could be spending on education, on making sure it's got high ranking. And the other thing I was just thinking, in South Africa, we have the University South Africa. And clearly, I think this statement needs to be presented to them, and those of us who have written and contributed to it need to go to those institutions. I sat on my university council for a number of years, and I was just thinking of the boards of universities or the councils. I think it's the responsibility of us as the people who do understand these things to ask for an audience, to present to our own Senate, to present to our own councils, and to build a critical mass of academic activists who are prepared to call out these things. I was just reading the last Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, which is the top ranked university in Africa, and very proudly so. And he was describing his experience about being a Vice Chancellor, and he said, no one should pay any attention to rankings. No one should give them more credit than they do, and they're not due much credit. But I was pleased to see that we were top. You know, in spite of the fees must fall or roads must fall or whatever was going on. And, you know, we need to just point these things out, that even people who run the top universities on a continent are saying that these are invalid measures. We've got to say it more. And then we've got to get to the journalists. I was just thinking, we all have access to the conversation. There's the Conversation Europe, Conversation America. There's a whole lot of them. Let's get this out there as a collective, so that more people understand why they're problematic. It's not about being against ranking. It's about saying that the way rankings are done is meaningless. It's meaningless.
Great, thanks, Sharon. And it does seem as though there is this issue of people working together rather than sticking your head above the parapet and going alone in terms of challenging the system and this industry. One of the other questions that I wanted to pose to you is the nature of the commercial conflicts of interest and the amount of resources that universities are expending on trying to improve their rankings, and the diversion of those resources away from the core academic functions that you would expect a university to focus its attention on. What do we know about the wasted resources that are going into the ranking system and the kind of profits that are being generated by the ranking organizations, some of which are owned by private financial equity funds? Do we know much about that, Marion?
We don't have amazing data, but we do have some indications. For example, that the QS stars system costs something like $30,000 for a university to go through this sort of parallel ranking process in which a star will appear next to their their listing and the ranking. And what's interesting is that there doesn't appear to be any correlation between how many stars they get in the QS star system and where they're ranked in the system. And it's also interesting that it tends to be the lower ranked universities that are buying into the system. So it's kind of like, yes, we're pretty far down, but look how many stars we have. So then they can post that on their website. You know, the financial impact, it's hard to quantify because it involves things like the University of Sao Paulo opening foreign offices all over the world in an effort to boost its internationalization. And they then had to close them all when they were in major financial crisis. So there are lots of actions that universities take that go beyond setting up an office to provide information to the rankers. You know, the way in which they invest their money, or governments invest money. I don't know, I was struck to hear that there are 2 universities in France that were fused by the government to create one mega university with the hope that it would be, you know, higher ranked. So there are a lot of financial implications of this that are sort of hard to trace because they're so multifaceted. And I just wanted to mention one other thing that a number of people have asked us whether, you know, that they could sign on to the declaration, which I think would be a very good thing to get more traction on this initiative. I think it would be very important for the rankers to see who is signing on. And in terms of mediatization, the Chronicle of Higher Education reporter asked me at one point, well, how many universities have signed on, and how many have agreed to boycott and not send information? You know, this was literally hours after we put out the statement. I thought, gosh, I wish our statement had that immediate impact. But clearly that's what they're thinking, that the degree to which universities will show concretely, we're signing on to this, we're putting ourselves out there, I think would be a really effective strategy. Thanks.
Thanks, Marion. We're coming to the end of the hour. I've got one more point that was raised by Michelle Stack about looking not just at the way that rankings operate in higher education, but the way the idea of rankings is also something that affects other sectors. You know, that rankings of all kinds of things, including of hospitals, and that this is very much tied with the logic of the market and with commercialization and the erosion of the notion of the public. So is there an issue here about trying to join up the problematic nature of commercialization and rankings across different sectors? And do we need to be thinking also about a bigger narrative about the public, about public services, public functions, the public interest? So that's a comment and a question, I think, from Michelle. But as we're coming to the end of the hour, let me just ask all 4 of you to either respond to Michelle's comment or to make any other final concluding comments, as you will. So who would like to kick off with the final round of comments from the panel? Riyad, do you want to start us off? Perhaps either respond to Michelle's comment or make any final comments yourself.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Michelle is suggesting, because I mean, if you look at rankings today, and this is very interesting, education rankings can teach us a lot about rankings in general in other cases, but education rankings are now being tied to city rankings. So the way you tell what a global city is, a world-class city, is also tied to whether or not it has world-class universities. So there are a lot of interconnections. The same could be said about hospitals and so forth. And that's because we're in a climate of data analytics. Everything has become numbers. And so that's a larger conversation that rankings play a role. But absolutely, I would agree with what Michelle's suggesting.
Thanks, Riyad. Sharon, you want to go next?
Also in response perhaps to Michelle, is that there's nothing wrong with measuring quality. It's actually quite important. But the point is there isn't a one size fits all. And so you see this a lot in healthcare. She mentioned hospitals. We really know that if you really want to get to the heart of whether something is high quality, you have to have a lot of metrics. You have to standardize so that you can compare one person with another. A very sick person who comes out with an okay result is very different from a relatively well person who comes out with an okay result, and you have to build this in. So if you are going to be doing these things, you have to do them mindfully and cleverly, and you have to have outcomes measures rather than input measures or product measures, process measures. So what would an output measure really be at a hospital would be, are you better at the end of your experience of being in that hospital? And the same thing about when you come out of a university. Are you making a positive contribution to society? And so I think that if we could look more at output measures as a better way of trying to imagine ranking systems, and this is true no matter what you're ranking. You know, in city rankings, you're a good city if everyone has a meal every day, can wash themselves, and has a safe place to sleep. That's a good city or town. So I think that these are the kinds of things we should be looking at. What is the purpose of the institution, and then is that institution meeting that purpose?
Thanks, Sharon. Eugene, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, having worked at also several hospitals over the past, 15 years, that similarly to my experience with these elite university, I was kind of blown away by seeing how much of the resources were put towards, getting higher in the rankings and receiving the constant emails. You should do this and you should do that. And my own personal assessment that, I was shocked to see some of these hospitals that are so high, because they often, they don't, it's not that they provide a better quality of care. They just have more resources to divert to whatever metrics are being used. In fact, sometimes they provide worse care. And so one of my favorite epidemiology studies of all time was a study that showed that at some of these top hospitals, people that were admitted for cardiac events, so either heart attack or heart failure, had significantly better outcomes during the 2 weeks of the cardiology conference during the year. So when all the professors were away, there was a significant improvement in cardiology care, and it's been shown across specialties now. And it's just a stark demonstration of, yes, the things that get you the points, NIH funding and all these things, have nothing to do with the patient care outcomes. In fact, they are often contribute to the opposite of it. And so just exposing how arbitrary and disconnected all of the metrics are, I think, is an important point, whether it's at the university or the hospital.
Yes. Thanks, Eugene. Marion?
Thank you. I feel like I've already talked a lot, so I don't have a lot more to say, other than I fully agree that information is very important, but this idea of ranking information is very problematic. The proxies that the rankings use, because they don't have good numbers to evaluate the quality of teaching, they rate it as the number of students per professor, which is clearly completely ludicrous. It depends on how good your professor is, depends on the setting, depends on so many things. And it's something that disadvantages a lot of universities in the global South to the degree to which they're trying to bring in as many students as possible and expand education. So at my university, for example, in the graduate programs, they've reduced the number of students that they admit because it looks bad to have so many students per professor, which I think is really doing a disservice to the population. So I think would really emphasize that we're not against information, and what the rankings have struck back, what US News has said to these boycotting universities in the States is, you just want to hide behind your wall of secrecy. It's not the case. We just feel that the information, the conclusions that they come to with their information are highly problematic. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. So we've come to the end of the hour, and maybe if I could just say a couple of words on behalf of the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health. And we definitely feel and see that this industry of global university rankings and the kind of behaviors that it incentivizes is harmful for global health. It's harmful for health equity. It's harmful for the kind of academic public health functions that we need to be able to respond to a similar event like COVID. So we are very glad and pleased to have had the opportunity working with you, the experts on our independent expert group, to produce this statement. Thank you very much for doing that. I think it's an incredibly powerful statement, and one that we will hope to be able to disseminate widely. And really what we're hoping now is for people to take the statement and run with it, and engage with people in ministries of education, ministries of health, with people who are running universities, administrators, senior academics, and really build a movement to kind of challenge both the way in which global university rankings operate, but also the manner in which these university rankings are being applied for less than benign purposes. So I'd just like to end this 1 hour webinar by saying thank you once again to the panel, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in other spaces. And also thank you very much to the audience and those watching this webinar. Bye for now.